said, low-cost, high-impact innovations in finance and in delivery of public services. That will take us through to the 2030 deadline with the achievements of SDGs. So without any further ado, let me turn to our next speaker, who is Ms. Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha is from Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. You have the floor. Again, 6-7 minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep the 6 to 7 minutes. Greetings, and again, thank you to the organizers for always inviting me to this very illustrious and thought-provoking discussions on development cooperation. I think with my 5 minutes now, I'll try and get to the points that I want to make and not go back to what has been a very interesting characterization of development finance and South-South cooperation that the previous speaker made. I think one of the challenges I found in yesterday's conversation and discussions, as well as in the parallel sessions, was trying to find that reconciliation between the quantitative and the qualitative impacts that South-South cooperation can bring in the context of a changing landscape around development cooperation. And there's two things that struck me. One is we're dealing not with intangible issues, but we're dealing with human lives and livelihoods. And how do we actually impact on people's lives so that we leave nobody behind? And that seems to be the point of departure for the discussion in defining whether we can create a theoretical perspective on South-South cooperation, as well as try and find the link between the evidence base and the theory. The second thing is, what are the tools we use or the resources we use? And so development finance and its evolution from the time in which it has been moved from ODA to blended finance. How do we deal with that? And how does that make a meaningful contribution to this motto of the SDGs, is leave no one behind? And so this brings me to 3 points I want to make in this regard. The first is, as research actors, think tanks that are not in the policy space but trying to influence the policy space, the question is, how do we use evidence-based studies to inform theory? Because I think very often as think tanks we try to take the theory and try and locate it within the evidence. But I think what the SDGs do for us now, given the short time frame, less than 12 years to implement, is the fact that it enables us to find an actionable framework of what is it that we're trying to do that brings not just states into the framework, but all actors from a broad realm of areas to think about what is it that we're trying to do in changing people's livelihoods. And this is where I think the role of evidence-based studies is important for us as researchers to think about how do we link it to policy implementation and policy research, which is the first point I want to make. The second point is that I think by utilizing the SDGs as an actionable framework, we can see the diversity of South-South cooperation. And in that is where we're trying to, I think, not lose the vibrancy of what South-South cooperation brings, but at the same time, don't let South-South cooperation become a status quo approach. So we're trying to link up with the technology advances. I think what the chair said in the end was a low-cost, high-impact kind of actionable framework. Now, with that point that I made around evidence-based research and informing theory, one of the things that struck me was that leave nobody behind means that after 2030, we should actually have a world that's veritably less in terms of inequalities, that people should be feeling included into the financial system, that they should be able to enjoy blended finance, access their savings, not feel like they've been overtaxed and overburdened, not seeing a widening salary gap. And this brings me to a very interesting book that I'm currently reading for my course, and that is The Precariat in Every Society. That class of people that are living in a marginalized setting. They don't have access. They constantly, their living standard is constantly in a precarious status quo. And they are the excluded that we need to include into this whole SDG framework. And so the question in my mind is, what happens after 2030 when there are still people that are left behind? And how do we then go forward in terms of the development finance that we're talking about, whether we have an inclusion in terms of a tax base, or whether we actually taxing people in order to cover costs at a higher level. And I can think of my country, South Africa, as an example of a very small tax base, but an overburdened policy space where the salaries are exorbitant. And I suspect that we may see similar trends in other countries where the political and economic crisis is actually linked to the way people are feeling marginalized from the system, whether they have access to resources. And then this means, what does the implications or impact have for global governance? The very institutions we are trying to reform, the very institutions we're trying to create inclusion for, are we not going to be just repeating the same issues, and then we continue to have an ongoing precariat class that remains on the verges of the global economy, of the national economy, of the domestic resources, and so forth? And as I was thinking about this, it made me think about the fact that after 2030, are we going to see another Millennium Development Goal or a 21st Century Sustainable Development Framework? Because the one thing we haven't necessarily discussed is populations are growing in particular parts of the world, and there are constantly burdens on national economies, national development programs. And so in Africa, with the positive population growth, there's constantly a need to try and include people into the urbanization of services. And as that happens, when people start to move from rural to urban, there's constant pressure on the system. So at what point does the system continue to contain itself, or does it begin to implode? And I think we've seen this with the questions around development finance, institutional reform, and so forth. And I just want to end on the point that I thought was very important that was made yesterday in terms of the multiplex world and where this multiplex world is going. And I think the multiplex world is interesting because there are those of us that can get into the multiplex center, but there are those of us who can't afford the ticket into the multiplex center. And if we cannot afford the ticket into the multiplex center, then the multiplex center becomes an institution of its own for a particular group of people who can access it. So I think one of the things that I want to end on is not to become so morbid, but to end on a positive note, and to say that one of the areas that South Africa has been pushing around development finance, particularly in infrastructure development and trying to ensure that it aligns to some of the global trends around development finance, is trying to use pension funds as part of that motion or that intervention for financing for development. There are different contradictions around this. There are contradictions of what does this mean on returns of investment and so forth. But I think it does represent some of the innovation that is coming out of Africa through South Africa's role, as well as in terms of the question of the illicit transaction flows that leave Africa every year in terms of resources, which South Africa has been key in the developing working group on the G20 as well, to use that as a mechanism of finding a viable, if not a much more policy-orientated mechanism of financing for development in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanusha, for all your very insightful remarks on financial inclusion, and particularly I like the last remark that you made about mobilizing the pension funds for sustainable development and infrastructure financing. And I think this is one area where South can learn a lot from South and develop new ways of harnessing the potential of pension funds. With that, let me turn to our next speaker, Professor Wu Jin from College of Humanities and Development Studies, Beijing. You have again 6-7 minutes, if you can. Thank you.
Morning, thank you, Chair, and also thank you, Professor Sachin and our colleagues from RES to inviting me for this conference. I think it's the right time to talk about the role of South-South cooperation. I think especially as the world economy is threatened by new type of trade protectionism and also political populism. Before I share with my comments for the documents and all these topics, I would like to share some findings from the field, what we did, the Chinese team in the southern country like Tanzania and other countries. The morning, the breakfast roundtable meeting, I share a little bit, use 2 minutes to share our work in the South-South Cooperation M&E framework report. That report was, that work was with the support of UNDP Beijing office. Our CAU team has developed a South-South framework and with the Chinese perspective, and also applied this framework in the case studies of China-Tanzania cooperation, and this work I think have been contributed by our next colleague like Andrew and Nissan last year, and the framework strictly follows the concept and the principles of South-South cooperation given by the UN. It covers the South-South trade and the South-South flaws of FDI movements towards regional integration and technology transfers, and sharing the situation and solutions and experts and other forms of exchanges. And it is also based on the principle emphasize demand-driven approaches and respect for national ownership and independency. Of course, equality, non-conditionality, and non-interference in domestic affairs and mutual benefit. And the framework serves two special purposes. One is to provide with the suited information in the partner country of Chinese South-South projects, so that the Chinese public will know about. Actually, I think I'm from China, especially Beijing. We are talking about in a lot of conference of South-South cooperation. But to be frank, within the Chinese society, few people understand South-South cooperation and what kind of Chinese project in the overseas and southern countries. So that the Chinese public will know what the Chinese is doing in other developing countries, and also the partner country will be also informed about the logic of the project implementation from Chinese perspective. By doing so, the mutual understanding will be, emphasized. The second is to analyze the outcome, output, and also impact of Chinese projects from partner countries' perspective, so that the policy makers and the project implementation from China will learn the relevant lessons and also act upon with improved actions in the future. And the framework proposed in this research contains 5 dimensions, that is political, economy, social, environment, and technical, following the 9 guiding principles of South-South cooperation and the 15 indicators. So far, we have finished the case studies on the section of infrastructure, agriculture, and health. And the biggest challenge when we are doing this work, when we're gathering the data from the field, is deficiency, the data deficiency. I think making South-South cooperation evaluation more difficult. So we used a qualitative method, data, rather than the quantitative to get different perspective on the project. So based on our research experience, we do think the diversity and the flexibility for South-South cooperation should be tolerated. And the first step to design South-South cooperation M&E framework should be adopted the availability and validate of existing system, data system. To be, for example, measurable, understandable, acceptable by as many as more stakeholders, and also pertinent by reflecting the nature of South-South cooperation. This should be the top concern when we design the South-South M&E framework and do the data gathering in the field. And lastly, I will share some points as my comments. I was invited to be. So Theoretically speaking, I think I have to say that agrees all the most of the statements. For example, the principle of South-South cooperation should be unnegotiable. South-South cooperation should not replace the North-South cooperation, but a complement to it. South-South cooperation is volunteer and a demand-driven process, etc. However, very little effort has been given on how to implement and evaluate the South-South projects. And compared with the North-South cooperation, South-South cooperation has many advantages in contributing to 2030 agenda of sustainable development. It is not only brings more development resources for developing countries, which can be used to provide better public goods and improve the people's living standard. Of course, it's also provides leverage for least developing countries, especially those developing on foreign aid, to enhance their negotiating power when accepting aid from traditional donors, so that the recipient countries can have the ownership in mobilizing all available resources in line with their national strategy and plans. Moreover, the technology and the development experience will also flow among